Mohammed joins us this morning from our studios in Abuja. She's the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. Thank you so much for joining us. And I don't even know how to begin. 2017 till now, it must have been quite a lot of work for you. Busy schedule, no doubt.
Good morning, Nigeria and Nigerians. It's wonderful to be with you, and it has been a busy schedule, but what else is expected? You're handling 196 issues in many countries around the world, and so I'm just pleased to be back home, pleased to be back on a visit that takes us around West Africa in our region.
Well, we know that you will enjoy it at home, but then, just as you said, 190 issues, definitely no mean task. Added to that, so many other issues that were not part of the plan at the beginning of the year, or even, as at the close of last year, which is COVID-19. We're still dealing with all of the issues on the list of the Sustainable Development Goals, topmost of which is the poverty question or the poverty problem, greatly exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, lockdown all over so many countries of the world. How has that affected things generally across whatever the economies are, developed economies, developing economies, undeveloped economies?
Well, I think it's been quite a shock. In January, we were all planning to embark upon the decade of action to get to the 17 SDGs and the 2030 agenda. And by February, on my return from a gender-based violence initiative in Papua New Guinea, we were suddenly faced with lockdown. And I think at that time, everybody was looking at what is happening. There's a health crisis. We have to respond to a microscopic virus that is putting a pause on the world. I think very quickly it was understood that it wasn't just the health crisis, it is the socioeconomic impact. And that was across developed countries, developing countries. And so with the UN, getting into a response that makes development now an emergency was quite a challenge. Having said that, we did deploy everyone, the WHO in the lead on our health response, but then seeing the rest of our agencies standing up with government in this new way of working and trying to get a global response to what is an unprecedented crisis across the world. Overnight, children were out of school, people were out of jobs. We were grappling to see how we could respond with the huge amounts of resources that were needed to fill many in developing countries' fiscal gaps. Already, our economies in the developing world were exacerbated. We saw an agreement that we needed a global response, but countries looked inwards. In developed countries, we saw trillions of dollars being spent, and yet the billions that were being asked to support developing countries were not coming. We saw supply chains suddenly broken. So many challenges came at once, and to stand up and to try to respond to that was what we did with governments. Fortunately, in the case of the health crisis and the response, the community here in Nigeria, the international community here in Nigeria, was able to gather around and to provide those first PPEs that you saw coming in to try to help support the strategy of the government on the crisis.
Well, as you said, COVID-19 exacerbated things, but if we take it back a little, poverty was a major problem all over the world, and tackling it for different governments was always an issue. Now, with COVID-19, it only got worse. How far back have we been taken as a result of COVID-19 in the fight against poverty?
Well, today on poverty, we're risking losing another 150 million people receding back into poverty, and that's what you want to stop, the slide back into poverty. But let's also remember that one of the greater challenges we have was inequality, and the distribution of that wealth. Even when it happened, those that needed it most were not getting it. Now, we want to see COVID not as a crisis that puts a pause on or even loses the gains that we've had, whether it is investments in health or infrastructure, jobs and education, but is to use it as an opportunity that the stimulus packages that we now have to have, how are we going to spend those resources to make sure the response today gets us a better recovery, and then we can perhaps catch up with the targets and the goals that we have for our national plans and for the vision of the 2030 agenda. That's possible. In the stimulus plans, you're seeing spending on young people and jobs. You're seeing spending on health systems. COVID shouldn't just be at the expense of a health system. It should be additionality. There are still immunization campaigns. There's still maternal mortality issues. Education, as children go out of school, we have to find a means to keep them online. That means more connectivity. More connectivity. What are our energy transitions looking like? And what money is going into our stimulus packages to ensure that that possibly happens. So there are the opportunities of better planned responses that government needs to have. Now, in the cases of our developing countries, the gaps that we have to fill is really what the international community needs to put on the table at the G20, at the G7, in international fora, that we find those resources and we take down the barriers to the access of those resources, that countries like Nigeria and others can fill those gaps to make sure that we spend on people. Locking down economies is having huge effects. Women are on the front line of this, whether they are at home and it's unpaid care work, or it is taking care and tending to people in our hospitals. It's the informal sector. This is where we're finding that women and young people are being hit hardest.
Now, just before we bring this home, at this moment, we're faced with that huge question of how do we recover better? And I know you have said that it is clear that we need a global economic consensus to define what we mean by recovering better. Now, with this gradual shift that we've seen from multilateralism to unilateralism across nations, just how much of a job is that, just defining it, having a consensus globally on what it means to recover better?
Well, very early on, when we were looking at the reactions of the G20 IFIs in March and April to see whether that global response was happening at the scale it needed to happen, it really wasn't landing as it should. And so here, the Secretary General, together with co-conveners of Canada and Jamaica, put together the Financing for Development initiative to bring countries together to put on the table what those issues were. First, of course, with liquidity. How do we get more money into our systems? How does the IMF provide those resources to come as emergency? The second was to look at the debt. The debt issue in many countries was already a looming crisis, and then again compounded by what was happening with COVID. So finding the space to breathe, ensuring that with the debt that moratoriums were given so that it would take us to the end. I mean, right now we're looking for the end of 2021. We have to the middle of next year. When we engaged in this in April, it was the end of 2020. So we are extending it to give breathing space for countries not to pay back their debt, but to give them that space to use those resources in the response. Then we of course looked at illicit flows. We looked at engaging private creditors who, quite frankly, were not engaging with this. This was an issue for low-income countries, but we were making the case that middle-income countries like Nigeria also have become vulnerable overnight as a result of the lockdowns and the impact on the socio-economic part. So investing was to really bring those resources, advocate for them, show that the impact, that we understand that governments have a responsibility to their people, so you have to look inwards, put on the oxygen mask, but once you've got it on, you need to look around you and help others, because it is in your own interest at the end of the day. So we were hoping that multilateralism itself would prove that we would go further together. We've said that the virus anywhere is everywhere. You don't just get rid of it in one place and think that it's not going to have an impact elsewhere where it exists. So it has been a conversation, a dialogue of leaders, of ministers of finance around the world to try to bring that home. Things are changing. We are seeing a change in some of the resources that are being negotiated bilaterally. We would like it to be done multilaterally, so there are blocks of countries that can benefit from the resources that come forward. But once those resources come, it's also then in our interest to make sure that they reach the people that they're supposed to, that social protection programs are invested in, that we see education as a part of that and health as a part of that. Jobs, entrepreneurs, young people who really have to have a job. They have to have a future that they can hope for. And we have to invest in those skill sets and the opportunities of startups. So very many things that we we perhaps were not doing so well before, we now have a sharp focus on, because everyone is looking to see how we are going to respond to the millions of people that have suddenly found themselves without work, uncharted territory, not knowing what is going to happen tomorrow. And this pandemic hasn't gone away until we get a vaccine. Therefore, the situation that we're in will be long, and the recession will be long. How we respond to it now will determine the quality of that Build Back Better and the recovery that we have post-2021, I would say. There's more of the same coming in 2021.
Just briefly, regarding vaccine, I mean, you must have seen that report about a vaccine that, I mean, prevents COVID-19 in 90% of the cases. That's good news. But, you know, the other side of that is the fact that a lot of countries are thinking, when would we get access to these vaccines if they eventually get ready? So for Nigeria, for example, and other countries, what is the UN doing to ensure that, you know, there's equitable distribution? Because you see countries already ordering for millions of vaccines. So what's the UN doing regarding that?
Well, the WHO right early on had recognized that we will eventually get a vaccine, but how will that be the people's vaccine? How will we ensure that everyone has access to it? And it's true, you have seen a number of developed countries already pre-buy against 3 or 4 possibilities of the trials that are going on with vaccines. A mechanism was set up. It's called the ACT Accelerator. It has moving parts in it, I would say, that have to do with the production of a vaccine, of therapeutics, of treatments. So it's more than just the vaccine. And then there are plans for how we distribute this. And I have to say here, this is why it's so important that we keep the resources in the health systems to ensure that those immunization programs that we have will probably be off the back that we will carry this vaccine to everyone. Currently, there is a huge shortfall in providing resources for the vaccine. It's over $30 billion gap. We had convened to see how these resources would come. Some governments were very forward-leaning. We saw the UK providing more resources in the health system. We've also seen that Nigeria has made some provisions. Is it going to be enough? Not as it stands today. And that's why there must be a global effort to ensure that that vaccine reaches everyone. That's something that we continue to work with. We continue to advocate that countries who have already pre-purchased make those resources also available and fill the gap. It is a gap that can be filled. This is just over 30 billion. We are seeing trillions spent in economies that are developed. You know, we'd say this is an investment in your future as well. As we continue to say, COVID, anywhere it is everywhere.
Let's bring it home to Nigeria for a bit. Quite a few times that you have, almost every response that you have given today to all of the questions that we've asked you, you've referenced young people. Young people, women, and all of that. And you are aware of what we know as the youth bulge in Nigeria. That population pyramid that was released by the National Bureau of Statistics also pointed to the fact that something in the region of more than 60% of Nigeria's population right now are young people. In fact, another figure added to that is the fact that Nigerians below 15 are about 41 or 43%, depending on which figures one is looking at. So it looks like what could be a blessing is like a burden now, because it's among this same population that we have the highest number of people living in extreme poverty and the highest number of people in unemployment. What are we not getting right?
Well, first of all, to think that youth are a burden is the wrong way to look at it. That's the wrong narrative. It is the largest cohort of youth that we've seen worldwide, and most of that we see in Africa, so the demographics are of concern. What I would say is that we have a challenge on our hands. We have an asset base, women and young people, who form a greater part of our society, of our economy, and we need to find better ways of targeting and investing in their skills, in their right to access services, their futures. And I think that's what we're not getting right, is that the plans that need to happen from a local government to a state government to a federal government and coherently work towards empowering young people, work towards empowering women, is where we've had it wrong. We've talked about it, but we've not actually done it. And I think that one of the things that this government in particular has taken quite seriously are the investments in infrastructure. We've always said that infrastructure, without it, you can't build the foundations of an economy. Now, young people have to be involved in that. And that infrastructure, for what? What are we building it for? Today, we're looking at a generation that is very different from ours. Technology is a big part of what will be their way of communicating, their way of doing business. It has got a huge opportunity. It has a downside because technology, like everything else, if it's misused or if it is not invested in at the levels and scale that we need, will not give you the benefits. But we're also talking about urban populations, and urban populations in cities are of the future. Over 70% of world population will be in cities by 2050. So we have to build for that and plan for it, and recognize how that is that's going to interact with the realities that we have. So it is why also when we talk about the SDGs, it's not just 17 goals. It's understanding our economies have to be more inclusive. They have to be greener or bluer, depending on whether you're talking about a transition on energy that needs to be solar powered, wind powered, or perhaps a blue economy for which Nigeria has great potentials. And it's just organizing the wealth that we have and ensuring that it is targeted at those who will help lift the potentials of this country. So I go back again to saying youth are not the burden. They are the challenge that we must overcome in putting them in the places that they need to be put, because they're the future. But that future has already started. It's now. And we've seen that as voices are raised around the world. Young people tasking the social contract between governments and themselves, challenging institutions to become much more responsive to their needs as well. So I think, investments, more investments in young people will get a return that will realize potentials of countries that are developing like this one.
Well, we'll come to those pockets of people in different parts of the world who are raising their voices, especially in Nigeria. But going back to what you said about, what we need to do and what, government has been doing, one of the observations a number of people have made is that governments come, execute one policy, and once that government is out of the place, out of the stage, another one comes, throws that one in the dustbin and starts another one. And of course, it goes on and on like that. So the question then is, and you've talked about the different tiers of government, is it a problem of policy or execution of those policies? I know that, while in government in Nigeria, at one point you served as advisor to a president on public sector reforms. Is that a challenge? Is it a problem of the execution of the policies or the policies themselves that are not futuristic for the young people in particular?
Well, it's both of them. I mean, you have to have policies that are responsive to the context and the day, and contexts are changing every day. The context in Nigeria that we have today is not just about a population or the inequalities and poverty. You also have the context of the humanitarian crisis, whether it is climate-induced or it is conflict, internal conflict, displaced persons, the northeast insurgency that we see. All of that has to come to play in what is sometimes a very short-term view of what needs to be done. The cycle of our democracy is 4 years, perhaps at the outer edge it's 8 years. And you have to find ways not only of working within the 3 tiers of government, as is in this country, but with the 3 arms of government. Institutions need to be strong to carry the kind of tasks that we're asking them. And there has to be a collaboration where it is not just about the federal government spending, but there are constitutional responsibilities of the other tiers. And so you need to come together with that spend to get an outcome that says all children are in school, all people can have access to health. A woman that goes in to have her baby will live with the hope that she's going to come out safely. But today, maternal mortality rates are so high, you're not quite sure. So these are things that are interactive within the tiers, but also within the 3 arms of government, our parliaments, the executive arms of government, and of course the justice. They have to come together. We need to invest in them. And that's, over the years, I think, has not been the most attractive of investments. And governments need to think through where those monies go and how you leverage other sources of finance from the private sector, so that government doesn't remain the only place. It remains the institution that provides enabling environments for others to thrive, from the local government to states and the federal level.
Well, we always talk about building institutions, making institutions strong, madam, but it would seem like it's almost like a mirage. We keep trying, we keep talking about these things, just as you said. What do we need to do to really strengthen the institutions so that they can work effectively as you're proposing?
Well, I mean, first of all, decide what institutions you need to carry the vision that you have. And often governments that are coming in to right-size your overheads in order to try to get what you need is a difficult decision. And to right-size, to build the capacities that you need within governments to reform institutions takes quite a lot of resources. Those resources are competing demands. Do you provide for health or education or water and sanitation, and then you want to invest in infrastructure? You don't have the resources available, so you're trying to find ways, first of all, to prioritize, hope that within your 4 years or 8 years that you can make the impact that you need at scale. So I think, you know, we're also challenged by the resources that are needed. But let's actually talk about the resources that we have. What are we doing with what we have, and how do we coherently have a conversation with states and local governments so that the whole of revenue that is available to us is used towards delivery, improving the service. I mean, you know, when you talk about the policy somersaults that we have, those institutions that are weaker are not able to hang on to those policies so that the new administrations that come can build on what has been done before and perhaps respond to what is a current context. It is a difficult spend. It's not the most attractive, because when you spend on institutional building, it's not seen overnight as you would build a housing estate or put power up for communities. But it is what I would say is the software if you want the hardware to work. And that's a very difficult spend. So prioritizing and doing it over time consistently, having a spend in building stronger civil service to deliver in health and education is the way to go. But it's a very unattractive spend, I have to say, because it's not seen in the first instance. But I believe that the lessons learned is, having neglected those institutions, we are faced with what we have today, where you know, these institutions cannot lift at many different levels of government. And I'm sure that you will see leadership around the country always talking about the capacity of their institutions to help them deliver.
Well, another thing we always talk about is the capacity, the potential of the youth. So let's go back to that youth component. I know you've spoken about the ENDSARS protests. You have, you know, asked for peaceful protests. And I recall earlier on during the protest, there was this rumor flying around on social media that the UN would intervene if protests last for 30 days. Of course, that proved to be untrue. But people would still like to know at what level the UN is interfacing with the government regarding, you know, the protests, the demands that have been put out, and, you know, finding a resolution at what level. That's if the UN is involved at all.
Well, the UN's always involved because this country is very much a part of the UN. And when these protests started, the Secretary General was keeping a very close eye, as he does with all protests around the world, as to how this was evolving. And, you know, I have to say right from the onset, you know, this was an incredible movement of young people who were well organized, well intentioned, had legitimate concerns, and came together to make that felt and to say to government, you need to take care of these issues that over time have been exacerbated, and today COVID is making an even bigger mess of it. And I think that was a good thing. I certainly was proud of young people that I knew who were part of this. But very quickly, we have to understand that when you go into a protest, and let's remember we were all young and activists at one time, that you have to have an end game. And in this particular case, there were demands made of government, and the youth succeeded because in the shortest possible time, government responded to say, we are going to take care of these first issues that you have raised, and many more were raised thereafter. That came to be means that there is an engagement, and that engagement needs to continue. It needs to continue by young people making sure they are there and pushing for those demands that they made to actualize. Government has to ensure that it has processes in place that are genuine, that we have confidence-building measures because trust is broken on both sides, and that we can move forward from the times of the protest. What is the UN doing about that? We've been asked to provide support in 3 particular areas. First, to make sure that these processes themselves can be stood up and can be ones that everyone is engaging in and that can see the test of time over the next months and perhaps years, because this is a transformation that is going to take time. The second is to ensure we support the National Human Rights Commission in standing up the panels that will look and will investigate some of the issues that have happened, and that we bring resolution to those in the shortest possible time. The third will be the support that is needed to underpin the Police Act of 2020 so that these reforms can actually take root and that we are able to have a communication strategy that government is able to tell people on time that they can follow the process and see what is happening. Again, what I'm saying here is that there are building blocks that need to be put in place that the past, and we have to acknowledge there have been many reforms that have been put in place to try to address these governance issues. What is it that has failed us, and how do we not make the same mistakes? And so the UN support to government is to make sure that we can put in those platforms, we can engage and continue to support the bridge building and the police reforms, the other governance reforms that have to be put in place to make this a reality in the short and in the long term.
You know, quite a number of issues to cover, but we understand you have quite a busy schedule. So let's talk about your visit specifically. I mean, you met with the president, you met with the vice president. Well, you're not new to the presidential villa. You've worked with presidents in the past, but this is different. And for people that may have caught the press as, in fact, the front page of the dailies, they're asking, what do we expect right after this visit, the meetings you've had? What should we be expecting? What should we be looking out for right after these visits?
Well, I think first is to note that the visit is about the international community who is saying we are present in some of the challenges that need to be addressed. And it is one of solidarity to countries, and that we begin with Nigeria, but we go on to Niger, Mali, Sierra Leone, and Ghana, and each one of them has a different context. Expectations are that we continue to push for the resources that are needed, and that countries like Nigeria will receive them, because we're putting a light on what government is doing, but we're also shining a light on the demands that young people and citizens have of their needs. Today, the visit will be to the northeast. It will be to look to see how we address the reintegration, the resettlement, the context in which that happens, addressing some of those root causes. And it is one of the reasons why we met with the vice president, who were able to launch an offer from the international community that we bring around the table. The UN brings around the table in Nigeria about $250 million towards some of those root causes, the jobs that need to be created, the access to health and education that needs to happen, the fiscal space that we need to create in order to bring in more resources. So I think your expectations should be that we are addressing the response, that you should begin to see more jobs in place. You should begin to see that we're coming back on track to invest in those programs that we had originally. However, the reality is that this is slow. It's not as fast. It's not treated with the urgency that it deserves. But I always say that our reality is not very good. Our aspirations are amazing. There is a gap between the two, and every day we need to work to close that gap. And we need to do it with all stakeholders. The more inclusive we are, the more we are communicating and accompanying the challenges that people and countries have, I think that the better chances there are for us to continue to create a sense of stability and to get to the end result that we would all like to see, that people have jobs, that people are, not witnessing the gender-based violence that we see in our communities, the frustration of, I don't know what will happen tomorrow, the anxieties that have been created by COVID that are bringing so many more issues up on the table, like mental health, which all over the world is a big issue.
Well, we have just about 2 minutes before we take a break, and then we'll come back to you to close. But very quickly, if it is possible, within 2 minutes, concerning the expectations that people should look forward to as a result of this trip, what specifically should the young people be looking forward to? I know that you've stated the issue, but if the young people who are quite restive now, as it would seem, are right now, what should they be looking forward to within the shortest possible time, given the limitations and that gap that you talked about?
Well, I think the first thing that I would say is that please stay engaged. It's really important for young people to engage at all levels. If you don't engage, then you won't reap the benefits of those protests that you went out on. So don't give up. There's an amazing way that you unify. Continue to use the better side of social media to do that. I've seen what social media can do in a really good, constructive way, but you must avoid having that hijacked. The UN has got an initiative called Verified, and Verified really makes sure that the good work that is being done, that your platforms are using, bring you together. So stay engaged. Get engaged with what the government is saying that they want to do. Hold them to account. Push them for those reforms. I think that you should see more investments in the fellowships, in the jobs, in the initiatives that are being taken up by government, by the support the international community has given to some initiatives. You should begin to see that you understand the legal processes that have to happen, that you can follow them month by month, that there is the change that you're asking for in the police reforms. This goes from behavioral change to investments in the police force itself, but also investments in the community, understanding that with all the rights that we're asking for, there are also obligations, and those too must be fulfilled. So be engaged, lead from the front. And you know, I know that young people in Nigeria and the rest of Africa can do this. And I think that that's very important in this process. And I would also say we're not just waiting for jobs, we're also looking to create jobs. So make also the demands for more resources to come to you, for your startups, for the entrepreneurial spirit that is amazing in this country. At whatever level you find young people, whether they've had the education or they've not, they're incredibly industrious and hardworking, and we have to provide the enabling environments for that. Government has said they are doing that. We should hold them to account. We should engage to make sure that that happens, and continue to make sure that your voice is loud, that you do this in a very peaceful manner. I mean, violence does not pay for anyone. It really doesn't. But a strong voice, continuity, know that you're going to go the short and the long haul. This is a journey to Nigeria's future, and that future should be shaped by young people today. And I think that they've done a really good job. Great first steps, but stay engaged.
Well, we'll take a short break now, madam, and when we return, we'll take your closing remarks, particularly about your visit to the Northeast. Stay with us. Thanks for staying with us. Well, Ms. Mohammed, tell us about your expectations with your trip to the Northeast. One major concern that everyone talks about, you know, countrywide actually, is that of security, and perhaps more importantly, in the Northeast. What are your expectations? What's the plan? And what's your take on this whole security conundrum?
Well, I mean, the security conundrum in the Northeast is one that has been exacerbated by it being more than just about Nigeria. It's about the externalities as well. So we can talk about the Africa context and the role that Libya and other countries have played in exacerbating the insurgency. The security forces still have a job to do, and I think that what they've done so far has actually seen a lot more stability in the region than we've had before. But at the same time that they are doing their work, we need to make the investments for those basic services and a space that in our communities people can come back. Even when they come back, basic services are there, security is in place. They have to rebuild their societies. They have to rebuild what is a huge trauma to young people, children who have become perhaps young adults even now, and parents. A whole of society approach needs to be taken to that whole resettlement, reintegration. It's not a question of just taking people back to their communities and leaving them to continue their life. They have to be supported through what has been a trauma over the last few years. And so really our expectations are to go there and to talk to the different parts of this whole tragedy. So the humanitarian crisis and the work that many of our agencies and stakeholders, NGOs have been involved in, the state government and local governments that also need to be supported to do the work that they're doing. In Borno State, there is a chief executive, a governor that is 24/7 on his feet trying to do the things that must be done, and we commend him for the work that he's doing and the partnerships that he's bringing. But he can't do it alone. So the support of the federal government, the support of the international community for the different strategies that we have in the Northeast. Some of that has got to do with the Lake Chad Basin stabilization program, in which we're bringing resources to try to bring back livelihoods, to try to address some of the issues around climate change, and also to, as we say, look at the huge population that we have to look at the informal sector, giving the skill sets that bring them into the formal sector, connecting them, not making it that, you know, technology is something for other people, but we can actually bring technology in and connect to education, connect to businesses. So it's a whole of society approach that we want to see and we want to support. And I think that the government has a plan. What we really need to see is taking that plan further and investing at the scale and the time that it needs to happen. It is a long road to that recovery, and each one of those steps that needs to be taken is sure steps that don't regress. We need to learn from the root causes in the first place of that insurgency. I was, you know, that's where I grew up. I went to school in Maiduguri, and I know that terrorists are not born. There are conditions that come together in an environment that give youth no hope, that make them very easy fodder for those who wish to cause the instabilities that we see in our region, and they're easily hijacked. And I think that that's what happened in those so many years ago, where we were not paying attention to, again, that social contract between government and the rights and aspirations of people. So we'd like to get back to that, and we think that by and large there are big efforts that have been made, but there are still many parts of Borno that are not inhabitable today. It is not secure. And those that are, how can we begin to do the resettlement, the reintegration, and building back those societies as a whole?
Those areas that are habitable, there's a challenge of desertification, maybe shrinking farmland. In fact, that population is increasing. So the farmland you had for maybe 20 people 20 years ago is now for maybe 200 people, and it keeps shrinking. Now, you've talked about recovery. There's a socioeconomic recovery plan which you launched with the vice president, and I want to believe there's some area that, you know, handles the Chad and their realities in that particular recovery plan. But looking at it deeper now, how does it work? How will it work in the next 2 years? I believe it's 2020 to 2022. How will the funds be sourced? How will they be dispersed? I mean, $250 million. What's the process, really?
Well, firstly, we would look to see that government is developing a pipeline of programs that need to be invested in around health, around social protection, and very specifically targeting women and young people. What are those initiatives? How will we raise the funds in the same way that we have raised the billions that we have for Nigeria, in calling the international community to viable investments that will get us peace and stability, which is good for everyone. And so for Borno, this is the same thing. What agricultural programs will we have? Housing programs, access to health. How will we strengthen those health systems so that you don't just have a primary health care center, but you've also got the institutional support for your doctors, your nurses, your community health care workers, and it is accessible to the poorest and the most vulnerable. In the same way that you just talked about the desertification, many initiatives such as the one that I heard yesterday from the Minister of Environment, the afforestation program that is happening, many programs that are trying to bring livelihoods back to the Lake Chad, whether it is farming or fisheries, even as the President embarks on trying to find the resources for recharging Lake Chad. There are still many initiatives that you can have with what you have. So how to make those investments and to make sure that they come sooner rather than later. I believe we have some programs that will be in place that will look at livelihoods that within the value chain of food security. That's important in that region, that we are investing in new farming methods that are perhaps closer to people's homes so that they are more secure, and that is plowed back into the economy. The returns that you get from that, as long as we have a market that is beginning to increase and to benefit everyone, then we are seeing the returns in revenues. Those revenues should go into the services that government should supply. We need to see the economy kick-started again, and that those that are in the local governments that have not been able to benefit from that, doing so. The last time I visited, we have a number of camps which for people who have been there for quite a while now, and it would be good to see how we can reintegrate them back into societies. Schools are going to be important. There are a number of initiatives where girls and young boys are introduced into the new way of learning, which is online. We have to close that digital divide. This is an opportunity. So some of those investments that you will see in the 250 million will go to what I would say is leapfrogging. We're not going back to pre-COVID. Post-COVID means we look forward, and that we bring people up to speed with what it is the rest of the world is doing, so that we can connect. And Borno is like any other opportunity in this country. How do we connect it with the rest of the world?
Well, it's in that same region that we've had some unfortunate incidences, especially concerning, development workers. The United Nations has had its own fair share of, loss of lives of some development workers who are doing everything they can to ensure no one is left behind. How do we ensure that that does not happen again?
It's a better collaboration between government, the security forces. We will always take risks serving humanity in very difficult contexts, and our humanitarian workers around the world deserve, every one of them, if they could have a Nobel Prize, they would. The World Food Programme got the Nobel Prize this year, and it really is a recognition of the sacrifices that are made, whether they are abducted, whether they're involved in the conflict, they lose their lives, or even to COVID. We've had some that have also lost their lives to COVID. And we continue that struggle. That's the struggle for peace, and to try still to make sure that children and women and young people, we get those resources that are needed to them every way we can. There is the looming crisis of famine, and we don't want the food insecure people that we see by the millions for that to be exacerbated, so we do have to reach them. But the collaboration that we have, it is, as the military forces will tell me, a theatre of war. And in that theatre of war, there must be a collaboration between government and those humanitarian workers who go in there for us to see that they are a safer environment as possible, and to navigate that to get to the people that we need to serve. Those that are isolated, we don't have access to, and just every day just working towards trying to get to more of them and bringing them back into the fold. I think there have been some successes, but there are still many that have been left behind, and those are the ones that every day we strive to get back.
You're visiting at a time Nigeria is celebrating 60 years since independence. Well, it's a year-long celebration, and you're a Nigerian. Yes, you're the UNDSG, but you're also a Nigerian. I don't know which one comes first, maybe Nigerian first. But, regarding Nigeria, there's been a lot of talk about how far we have come. And I think you were born just a year after independence. So, you understand this well. There's been a lot of talk about how far we have come, how far we have to go. And I'd just like to get your thoughts on this. For the next 10 years, maybe, what should be our focus as a nation?
I think, yes, I am. I'm an independence baby, a celebration of Nigeria's independence. And so my generation knew the very best part of Nigeria because we had the best education. We were exposed to so many things that were about nation building. And at that time, a service that from the civil service, we really did serve. I mean, that's how we saw our parents. The next 10 years should be about, I think, the reflection on how we are better together than we are separated by what has really been a real problem for us with ethnicity, with religion, with the political divides that have been created. The diversity and strength of Nigeria's fabric has been weakened. And I think over the next 10 years, we should find ways of making sure that this, as I say, the asset base of our country, our women and our youth, that we strengthen those threads of our fabric because they are very strong, they are very diverse, and we have to learn to respect each other's value to this great nation that we call Nigeria. And that's what we have to do. We have to hang together because individually we won't be able to do it. The lift is huge. The next 10 years to take this population where it needs to go requires us to join hands together. We need to see the good in us. And we need to recognize the glass that is not quite full. What are we going to do to fill it? We need we really need to see the good in Nigeria. And so much has happened that is good about us. And yes, there are lots of things that are not right, but if you dwell on them, then we're never going to make it. So I think we need to recognize what is not right and work towards making it happen and know that we can do this together individually and collectively. We have responsibilities. And to respect each part of this country, we all have something to add in value, but we have to invest in that. So the next 10 years is the last 10 years of the 2030 agenda, the 17 goals, and just look at those goals as an integrated way in responding to Nigeria's needs. They're very, very representative of those needs that we have. Education is a big one. A society that says no to violence against women, against anyone for that matter. A society that really empowers entrepreneurial spirit that we have and that we lead in this continent because that's what's needed, leadership. And Nigeria can provide that leadership. It's
Speaking
all over.
of leadership.
I mean, particularly when you see the young women that we have.
Right. On that note,
it's too good to miss. So I'm very hopeful.
On that note, now you talk about leadership and women. Do you still think that a woman will succeed President Buhari as the next president of Nigeria?
That is my hope. That is my hope, and I do not see that there isn't a woman that cannot do that. And I always believe that you should strive for that aspiration. You don't fail for want of trying. So, women should stand up. They are 50% of the vote. And if they can convince the he for she's, the men who support women, then why not? Absolutely, why not? There is no reason why a woman cannot lead Nigeria. And I think that what we really need, whether it's a man or a woman, is a Nigerian, someone who looks at this country in its unity as a strength and really begins to talk about moving forward, realizing those aspirations or potentials that we talk about, move from the paper to the practical realities that can happen in our 774 local governments, in our 36 states and FCT. There is work to do, and it is possible. And it's certainly possible under the leadership of a woman.
Well, the United States of America is celebrating a lot of firsts. We look forward to that first as well in Nigeria. Well, we have to thank you very much, Ms. Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Yeah.